Anything that the government is now throwing at you as disclosures are designed to distract you from the big whale that they've been covering up, that they themselves made into the most pressing matter.
Glenn Greenwald came out firing recently, talking about how the recent Russiagate releases are one big giant distraction from the Epstein story, but he also gets into the merits of them, whether he thinks that new information is gleaned from this, and the chance that those they're naming as criminals right now, like Obama and Comey and Brennan and Clapper, will ever be charged for any crime. So let's get his take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
So I actually think Tulsi Gabbard's revelations on their own are substantive and meritorious and important and deserve a lot of attention. But I do think at this point, anything that the Trump administration is doing is intended to feed their base that is still very confused and upset and angry, for the most part, by this bizarre, increasingly bizarre posture that they've taken on the Epstein revelations, namely not to make any, led by not Pam Bondi or Kash Patel or Dan Bongino, but by Donald Trump, that anything that they're kind of suddenly unveiling is presumptively an attempt to distract people from that anger and that confusion and that growing suspicion about what they did with Epstein. And the problem for them is that the suspicions that have emerged that I don't even think were that present before, that Donald Trump fears that his name is in the files and therefore wants to make sure they're not released, even if his name isn't in the files in any way that's particularly incriminating. But the climate that has been created around the Epstein files, and I've always thought the Epstein case has important questions to answer, and I still think the Epstein case has important questions to answer, including the ones I've outlined at length, such as whether he worked with or for any foreign or domestic intelligence agencies, and what was the source of his massive wealth, and why were these mysterious billionaires embedded in the military-industrial complex so eager on just seemingly handing him over huge amounts of wealth in exchange for services that seem very amorphous at best.
Yeah, I have to be with Glenn on this one. Overwhelmingly agree. This does seem to be a deflection, whether the claims within them are meritorious or not, especially if it's just going to be floated out there without any real tangible, actually actions to match the allegations here. How deeply Comey and Brennan and Obama were in on this thing, but we're not going to charge them. You can say they're vile criminals. Trump has flirted with calling them treasonous. I think Gabbard has as well. But if they're really treasonous, what are you going to do about it? Because precedent doesn't exactly say you hold these people accountable, just like they didn't Fauci. Fauci went through the duration of Trump's term and was given medals by him at the end of the term. I mean, Trump surrounded himself with people like John Bolton. And, we just haven't seen the kind of reprisals that these villains deserve if these claims are true. And I do believe they're true. I believe the Russiagate hoax was exactly that. It was the tool of the deep state to wield against Trump. But this is a deflection. And it's a deflection because a lot of Trump supporters care about Russiagate like they care about the Epstein story. But I think people are starting to see through this a little bit in what they're doing.
I think there's a lot of unanswered questions that are important, to say nothing of whether there's evidence that very powerful and important people participated in the more sinister aspects of what it was that he was doing, and whether any blackmail arose from that. And of course, Donald Trump's name is going to be in some of these files for so many reasons. He was very good friends with Jeffrey Epstein at one point. They spent a lot of time together. It seems like most or all of that time took place prior to the conviction of Jeffrey Epstein in 2007. That has its own very odd set of questions around why he got such a incredibly lenient deal for crimes that most people are sent to prison for a very long time. There's actually an excellent discussion that, if you haven't seen, I want to recommend on all of this, which is Daryl Cooper's discussion with Tucker Carlson on Tucker Carlson's show about the Epstein case. Daryl spent huge amounts of time putting together the entire history of Jeffrey Epstein, where he came from, how he emerged on the scene, who his key contacts were, where his wealth came from, the questions that have arisen, the way in which they've been buried. That it was a very, despite what has what people have tried to concoct or depict about Daryl Cooper, in large part because of his, let's say, unconventional views on World War II, but more so his harsh criticism of Israel, that he's some deranged, unhinged fabulist who doesn't understand history. He's actually one of the most scrupulous and meticulous commentators and analysts I've seen, by which I mean he really does only very strongly cling to facts.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on Daryl Cooper. He does a great job, and guess what? They'll say the same things about every critic of Israel when it comes to the corporate narratives, when it comes to what neocons say toward those people. They'll always be branded as vile anti-Semites. They do it to Glenn, too, and he's Jewish. So, yeah, I could not recommend Daryl Cooper's material more, not only in the form of his Martyr Made podcast, but also what he posts on Twitter, etc. But Glenn's right, too, about the fact that it isn't genuinely surprising, or it shouldn't be genuinely surprising, even though it's being portrayed that way, that Trump's name is in the Epstein files. I mean, he had a long-term relationship with Epstein. All indications are that relationship soured over a real estate deal gone wrong in 2004. And they got in a bidding war over a property, and after that, it doesn't seem like they had any connection. And, you know, I'm open to any new information that comes forward linking Trump to any of Epstein's crimes, just like M. Clinton or Dershowitz or Bill Richardson or any of the other people that the victims named as, you know, being part of this thing. I'm totally open to it. But I really strongly doubt that Trump himself would be surprised to learn that his name was in the Epstein files. By all indications, he cooperated with the investigation as it was starting under his first term. That happened while he was still in office, and he did have that long-lasting friendship. So it would be actually surprising, and more surprising, if his name didn't appear in any way in the actual investigation materials and, you know, files. So that's what we're dealing with here. I don't believe that he would have responded differently than he has now if he knew his name were in the files. You know, the White House cover-up, notwithstanding, has been a total disaster, from the Bindersgate thing, where that was a complete nothing burger that revealed nothing, to the Trump administration officials going back and forth about previous statements and correcting them, and, you know, doing this whole spin campaign to try to bury this thing. Notwithstanding all that, I don't think this is actually germane, even though you'll see people run with it, though, his name's in the files. I mean, it should be in the files. I think Dershowitz and Clinton and those guys' names are in the files too. What really matters is who's implicated in the crimes, what connections Epstein had to intelligence services, as Glenn's saying, where he got his money. I think if you really do follow the money, and by the way, the FBI is sitting on a lot of information regarding his money and his wire transfers that they're not giving to us, that is what would lead us to the truth. They're not going to give it to us, though.
And has no problem admitting, which he often does, that there are certain things he doesn't know, that there's holes in his understanding, that there's holes in the information. And there's zero conspiratorial thinking or even speculative thinking in this discussion, or very little. It's all just a chronicle of facts in a way that is laid out, not just to understand the Epstein case, but the reason why it's captured so much attention about the behavior of our elite class. And so I do think Donald Trump's name appears in these files the way the Wall Street Journal has reported it did.
Yeah, and I believe he had that meeting in May where he was told that, despite his denial of that. But again, it shouldn't be surprising. The Trump administration's handled this the worst possible way in so many regards. And if Trump would have gotten ahead of this and said, hey, yeah, my name's in the Epstein files, of course it is, because, you know, we had a relationship in the 90s. You know, I'm not implicated in any crimes. I'm not involved in any crimes. If he would have been straightforward with that, like he is about so many other things, even about his personal life, the fact that he doesn't drink, stuff like that really actually would win people over more so than now. Don't get me wrong, if they covered up this thing like they are, there'd still be questions. But if he handled this differently, it would be treated differently, even including by his supporters that are having serious questions about this.
And Trump was explicitly asked outside the White House by a reporter just like 2 weeks ago, did Pam Bondi give you a briefing in May in which she indicated to you that the Epstein files contain your name? And to that, he explicitly said no. And that's exactly what the Wall Street Journal is now reporting had happened. Most journalists know that that happened. There were leaks inside the Justice Department and the White House that this is what happened. And again, I would be shocked if Donald Trump's name did not appear at some point in the Epstein files in some capacity because of his close friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. They were in the same West Palm Beach social circles, which is a very small set of very rich people who compose that society. The U.S. attorney who ended up being appointed, who oversaw Jeffrey Epstein's sweetheart deal, ended up being appointed by Donald Trump as Secretary of Labor. He clearly has positive feelings for Ghislaine Maxwell. In that notorious interview, he said, "I wish her well," something that Donald Trump doesn't say about most criminals, let alone ones imprisoned on charges that they trafficked underage girls.
Yeah, a lot of people actually think this whole thing is a setup to pardon Ghislaine Maxwell. I don't necessarily think that. I guess we'll have to see if that pans out. But, you know, Trump has said much more warm things toward Ghislaine Maxwell since this has happened compared to Epstein. He said, "I wish her well." It's a very simple statement. It's a lot better than what he and others have said about Jeffrey Epstein. So, you have Alan Dershowitz out there kind of floating the idea of pardoning her. You know, she wants to talk right now. I think someone from the DOJ actually did talk to her. So, I doubt that information is going to get out to the public either. But, a lot of people think that that's what's being set up here.
But the climate that has been created in large part by his closest followers, Pam Bondi and Kash Patel and Dan Bongino and his own personal attorney, who is now the U.S. attorney for New Jersey, at least for a little bit while longer, and some of the leading and most influential MAGA influencers were the ones who created this climate where if your name is even remotely associated with Jeffrey Epstein, your entire life and your integrity and your character are instantly cast into doubt.
Yeah, this is true. This is what they did with, the Black Book. It contained information about Epstein's friends or associates when a lot of those people probably had nothing to do with this, but some of them probably did. It's probably a mixed bag, and there shouldn't be guilt just by association. But we also want to know the evidence and the materials behind this so we can make those judgments for ourselves. But he's right, Bongino and Kash Patel talked endlessly about this stuff, about this client list, so much as the client list became something of a right-wing fable. And that's not to mean I don't think information doesn't exist on the fact of Epstein's clients and associations, but I don't think it's on a singular, regularly spaced Excel spreadsheet that is in one location and that's the thing they're being withheld. I think it's breadcrumbs and money trails and different information that leads us to those routes, but not a single list.
One of the first times I really noticed this was when the Wall Street Journal reported on a series of contacts between people that no one knew had known Jeffrey Epstein and Jeffrey Epstein, one of whom was Noam Chomsky. And the reason that happened was because Jeffrey Epstein had a very specific and passionate interest in academic institutions in Boston, especially the two most prestigious, Harvard and MIT. He funded various research projects. He gave $125,000, for example, to Bill Ackman's wife in order for her to have some sort of research project. And he had 2 or 3 dinners with Noam Chomsky. And Chomsky was very contemptuous of the questions from the Wall Street Journal. I guess that's what happens when you're 92. You don't take any kind of smear campaign seriously. You don't really care. And he just said, yeah, I had dinners with Jeffrey Epstein. He was a very well-connected and wealthy person. Now, oddly, Jeffrey Epstein was very close friends with the former Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Baruch, who obviously Noam Chomsky would have a great deal of animus towards, and Jeffrey Epstein was very connected to the Israeli government in all sorts of ways, including through his primary benefactor, the multimillionaire Les Wexner, who handed over to Epstein billions of dollars, it seems, in assets. So it is an odd person for Chomsky to know, but at the same time, if you're one of the most intellectually heralded professors and scholars in the Boston area at one of the most prestigious schools in the world, MIT, where Chomsky spent almost his entire life as a professor of linguistics, that is the kind of person that Jeffrey Epstein tried to target and befriend to make himself feel important, to make himself feel intellectually relevant.
Yeah, I think this is true, no doubt. We know that Epstein tried to involve himself in academic circles and academic institutions. He visited Harvard something like, I think, 30 or 40 times after he was convicted of child molestation charges in that first conviction. And they even built a special office within Harvard for him. He had a very deep and close connection to Harvard. That's something not often brought up about Epstein, by the way. And I would have no doubt that there would be people in academic circles that he crossed paths with, had conversations with, like Chomsky, that weren't involved in the criminal behavior. But I also think that some of the prominent people he associated were involved in the criminal behavior, because everything leads us in that direction, and in the direction of intelligence connections. And that's the missed part of this story still, despite everything that we can learn from, Whitney Webb's great book, One Nation Under Blackmail, Tucker's interview with Daryl Cooper, all the information that's been compiled about this, that's the missing factors.
And yet, you would have thought that that revelation by itself proved that Chomsky had gone to that island multiple times and had sex with underage girls and was a pedophile. So there has been a lot of speculative guilt by association and hysteria that has surrounded this story, such that anyone whose name appears in those files is likely to have suspicion and doubt cast on them for the rest of their life, even if the connections were innocuous. And I'm sure part of what Trump wants to avoid is any indication that his name appears in those files because of that climate that will spill over onto him, including by many of his own followers.
Totally agree with Glenn here, but that doesn't help when you conceal the fact that if Bondi told him he was in the Epstein files and then you lie about it, that makes it even worse. So again, Trump's handled this miserably. Terribly for people that wanted transparency, and terribly for people that have tried to defend him. Hey, he's not implicated in any way, but then he lies about being informed that his name's in the Epstein files. Again, it would have served his interests much better if he came clean on that and said, yeah, why wouldn't my name be in the Epstein files? So yeah, I think Glenn's right, and it just sheds light about how Trump's response to this has been so horrendous in so many ways and in so many different directions.
And then there are likely things in there that might, one of the reasons why investigations are typically kept secret, including grand jury proceedings, is because there's a lot of accusations that get made that are unverified, but if they're published, they may seem like they have credibility. That was part of what we had to deal with the NSA, with the Snowden documents. Much of the archive, a lot of the archive contained documents where they wanted to spy on certain people, and they would speculate that those people might have ties to terrorist groups or to Al-Qaeda, or to Islamic extremism, or engage in other kinds of crimes unrelated to terrorism, but they were never charged with that. There was no evidence for it. It was just speculation about why the NSA thought they should spy on these people. And had we published those documents with their names, we would have destroyed their reputations forever based on accusations that were completely unvetted and just appeared in these documents. But clearly, Trump panicked when he learned that his name was in there, and that is when not only did he order everything to be stopped, no more disclosures, the investigation closed, but when out of nowhere he began asserting that the Epstein files are all a fake, are all fabricated, or at least much of them are fabricated, and claimed that they were the same kind of hoax that Obama and Hillary and Biden and Jim Comey and John Brennan manufactured for Russiagate.
Yeah, that was the worst part of this. Calling it a Democratic hoax and saying that in several consecutive days was the worst angle of this gaslighting campaign. And there's been many phases of it. I've talked about it in other videos. It was first basically shove it under a rug. That's it about Epstein. Why you'd be asking a question about Epstein, 24 hours after this release, that turned the world on its head over the story. And then the next day, it's like, they're boring. It's a Democratic hoax. No one wants to see that. It's made by the same vile villains that drummed up Russiagate. Well, the attention of Americans is short, but it's not that short. And when it comes to Trump supporters, it's really not that short, who paid attention to Russiagate and how that progressed over 2 to 3 years with the deep state and the Democrats and many of the neocon and establishment Republicans trying to team up and undermine Trump's presidency. They remember that. And they remember that the Democrats didn't touch the Epstein story back then. Even if they thought it implicated Trump, they didn't use that as a weapon against him at the time. There are very few Democrats that have talked about this over the Biden years, with maybe the exception of people like Ron Wyden that did talk about some transparency issues related to this. And he's still doing that, by the way. He's still talking about how there's $1.5 billion in wire transfers between Epstein and, important people and prominent people that we should get answers on. But the Democrats didn't, by and large, use this. So yeah, Trump's response has been terrible. I don't know if it's that he panicked. I would actually be surprised if he was surprised that his name was in the files. Like, this investigation had to have discussed him at some point. He was friends with Epstein, very close friends, according to Epstein saying at one point, like, Trump's basically my best friend. Trump didn't say that about Epstein, though. And like I said, it looks like they have had a rift. But for him to lie about this was the worst mistake he could have made, especially in this climate where even his supporters are looking at him side-eyed like, what do you have to hide over this? It's the Trump administration's fault for how they've handled this and how they've drummed this up only to let people down immeasurably.
And the Steele dossier, and like all of a sudden, the Epstein files went from the most pressing and significant matter, the disclosure of which would be the key ingredient to deciphering the sinister globalist elite that runs the world. And then overnight just suddenly became a hoax, a bunch of fake documents that never should see the light of day. Obviously, the only reason why Trump would suddenly concoct that excuse, oh, they're filled with falsehoods and forgeries, was because he was fearful that it would harm his reputation or the reputation of people very close to him and who he cares about, and so said, no, this should never see the light of day. This is just another Democratic Party hoax that you idiots are falling for.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Glenn's exactly right on this. I've never seen Trump basically ratioed on social media, but when he was saying the Democratic hoax thing related to the Epstein story, he was getting ratioed. And that just doesn't happen on Twitter or Truth Social. There's an account on Twitter that feeds his Truth Social into Twitter, and his Truth Social, you had real big pushback to that. And I've never seen that phenomenon really attack him that way. And you did see it here. And the polls are reflecting the dissension that people are having, including his supporters on this. He's losing approval ratings, clearly. Various polls, I think, from Rasmussen and CNN, say whatever you want about them, but they're showing not only is that hurting him, but the differential between that hurting him and things like rearming Ukraine and the war in Iran hurting him are large. This is the biggest schism in the Trump coalition, is over the Epstein handling. Clearly, that's been pretty reinforced, even if you cast doubt on polls, from CNN or Rasmussen, what they say, there's reason for that. But when you see the gaps between the things that are hurting him, it does make sense that this is hurting him more. And
that behavior obviously fueled suspicions even more, as have the subsequent reporting from the Wall Street Journal about that birthday greeting that Trump sent to Epstein that he denies, but the Wall Street Journal reported. And then the subsequent reporting that Pam Bondi briefed him that his name appears in these documents. So anytime anyone thinks about the Epstein documents for even 1 second, that kind of loss of faith and trust in Trump is something that once it breaks is very difficult to put back together. And they are desperate to just, the day after the Epstein files, they said, hey, here's the Martin Luther King files. It's like, I guess it's good to see the Martin Luther King files, kind of like the JFK files, in that these are documents that should have been released a long time ago. There's zero reason for secrecy. It was one of the most consequential historical events of the last 70 years in the United States. We should be able to understand what our government knows about that event. But it wasn't like anybody was so eager. Anyone thought that was the key to deciphering much of anything. It was an important historical event. And there, from all appearances, nothing particularly surprising or shocking or informative about any of those documents. That was clearly a way of saying, here's a new shiny toy that you can go look at and try and forget about Epstein.
Yeah, I do think that was their intention. And what does it say about the regime when they just have this in their back pocket that they promised to release a long time ago? and they just have it for these moments. The timing of it can't be avoided. Same with the Russiagate stuff. They unveil this right now because of the schism happening within Trump's coalition, within his MAGA base, that hate how he's handling Epstein. So, here's some red meat. Here's a shining toy for you guys to pay attention to. And don't get me wrong, I'm very glad that those documents are being released too, the MLK files. I need to take a deeper study into that. I do think they divulged some additional information so far from the little bits and pieces I've seen about that. But Glenn's right, that doesn't decipher the modern political elite, the globalist elite, and Epstein's network of criminals, this network that he's been involved with in arms trafficking and money laundering and intelligence connections that people were expecting. And there are those connections. They never talk about it at the federal government. You'll never hear Pam Bondi or Kash Patel talk about the fact that, Les Wexner showered this guy with millions of dollars for seemingly no reason, that Ehud Barak stayed over at his house for prolonged periods in Manhattan after his first child molestation charges, and, Ehud Barak was also, in addition to the Israeli prime minister, the head of the military intelligence in Israel for a time frame. You'll never hear stuff like that. But that's what we want answers to. There are those things out there, and people know about it, so that's what we need.
And the revelation by Tulsi Gabbard, especially in the time frame in which it occurred, most definitely, unfortunately, because as I said, they're consequential, is being contaminated by this perception that anything that the government is now throwing at you as disclosures are designed to distract you from the big whale that they've been covering up, that they themselves made into the most pressing matter, J.D. Vance as well, and Donald Trump Jr., but also the idea that they want to regain your trust by showing you that they're redirecting your attention somewhere else. So, yes, unfortunately, it does have the stench of that.
It certainly does, and, these Russiagate revelations are interesting. They are important. According to the people that studied this case and this story the longest, like Matt Taibbi and Aaron Mate, they say that there are substantive things in these document release that they gave. But at the same time, it was designed to take your attention off Epstein, and the questions aren't going to be quelled, especially when, hey, they're dangling Obama and Brennan and Clapper and Comey as supervillains, as people that are worthy of disdain and disgust and that are treasonous, but you're not going to indict or charge any of them. You're not going to carry out any prosecution campaigns against them. If so, let me know when Obama's first court date will be, because I don't think that's going to happen. The precedent for that, even in the Trump administration, isn't great, despite, all the theatrics involved with, everything involving Trump and, him going after the deep state, draining the swamp. He really hasn't done that, and he hasn't done that since his first term. Remember the whole lock her up thing? If I was in power, she'd be in jail. Well, no, he had excuses for her not being in jail, despite the fact that Hillary Clinton was a war criminal. Hillary Clinton was worthy of condemnation for many things, including the email scandal, the Benghazi debacle that led to the death of an ambassador, etc. That is what we are seeing as Americans that are dissidents or, maybe even supporters of Trump that see how he's handling this and don't like it. It's clear where this is going. It's going forward through a cover-up. There's deflection methods, and the MLK files and the Russiagate release are all part of that. Not saying I don't want them. I'm glad we have them. I actually think other administrations wouldn't be divulging some of this information. Certainly not so on Russiagate. If Harris was in office, we wouldn't learn the totality of the absurdity that was Russiagate and the hoax carried out in the name of the deep state against Trump. We never would have. But again, they're not going to charge these villains that were in charge of Russiagate, just like they're not going to charge the associates of Epstein or the intelligence contacts that he had, or even divulge information of those escapades to the public. That's where we're sitting. Largely agree with Glenn here on most things. The only big thing I think I really kind of disagree with, that Trump would be surprised that his name is in the Epstein files. That doesn't tell us anything, but he certainly hasn't helped the situation by lying about it. But I do want to hear what you guys have to say about it. Let me know down below. Is Glenn right? Can Trump get away from this Epstein story in any way? Or is his entire presidency and coalition jeopardized at this point? Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Glenn also. He does great journalism in an age with few great journalists. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help support the channel and gain access in the process to all my videos before they release out on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.